The Dallas Cowboys have signed yet another UFL player. Does Gareon Conley have any chance to make the 53-man roster? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. And on today's show, we're talking about a UFL signing, another UFL workout, and if the Cowboys have the worst running back room in the NFL. But let's start with Gareon Conley, Landon, who the Cowboys worked out last week. And now that the UFL season is over, the Cowboys have announced that they've signed Gareon Conley. What are your thoughts on the move?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very Dallas Cowboys signing, right? A former first-round pick. I mean, this is a twofer, right? It's a former first-round pick and a UFL player. So
Yeah.
Will McClay's eating good tonight. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a situation where Gareon, was obviously a highly thought of recruit coming out of Ohio State, got drafted by the Raiders in what was an infamous, let's say, draft class, if I'm not mistaken. Just it didn't quite all work out for him. I mean, I think he ended up something with like 4 interceptions in like 2 or 3 seasons or something. But there had been lots of already talk before he got drafted about off-field stuff, and you probably have a better rundown of exactly how his Raider career went down, but
Not great.
Will say not great. I think that's probably, that's probably the summation I remember as well. But I will say that, I thought that coming out of college that he was an athletic specimen at the position who I felt like didn't quite have all the tools that you wanted in a first round corner at times. I felt like even with all the other stuff that may have existed off the field, that he was going to be overdrafted. So, fast forward now to a situation where you're not buying that high. You're not spending a first round pick to go get that guy. And this price, a vet minimum contract from the UFL, seems like an appropriate spend for this type of talent and potential return. So, would I have loved Gareon Conley as the Cowboys draft pick the year he came out? Absolutely not. Do I like it a lot more now that we're talking about a UFL signing and probably a vet minimum deal? I think I like that a lot more, just because there's no risk, and the upside is maybe you get a decent guy who could be a rotational guy on the outside.
I obviously never mind the Cowboys taking chances on former high pedigree players, bringing in the camp. And if it doesn't work out within 2 weeks, boom, you move on and it costs you nothing.
Yeah.
Like there's no downside here. The upside is he was a really good corner at Ohio State. And I know that doesn't mean a ton. He's still very close with Malik Hooker. And I wonder if maybe Malik had a little bit of like, hey, let's bring him in, try him out, see how it goes. I will say his last year, let's get to the Raiders stuff. It was a disaster with the Raiders for a million different reasons. He didn't play well. The defense was awful. Paul Gunther was a little over his head as a defensive coordinator. They were running. It was a bad situation. I'm not sure any cornerback that they would have drafted in that 2017 draft would have worked out. Let me just leave it there. He goes to Houston in 2019, and he's actually pretty decent. Now, he plays mostly as an outside corner, plays a little bit in the slot, and I think he was a league average cornerback. He certainly wasn't that the 2 years before he got with the Raiders. So then he goes, then the COVID year happens in 2020, messes everybody up, goes to the UFL, and obviously performs well enough over there that the Cowboys were interested. I mean, why not? He's 28 years old. He just turned 28. You probably need more outside corner depth anyways, at least to get you through camp. Why not bring him in and see how it goes?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's an upside play. You're not committed to him. And if the worst comes to worst, if he's good enough that you could actually trust him on the field occasionally, I mean, he's honestly a guy that you could probably stash on the practice squad and not even take up a roster spot, right? But still good enough to play, maybe in the game if you have an injury or something. We also need to kind of recalibrate our roster projections. We need to remind ourselves that with these new rules, with the practice squad and the allowing of players to come up, like that has greatly expanded the roster and the type of players that can be on it, right? So that's why I think you're seeing a lot of this UFL stuff happening, is because these are all players of that ilk where they're loading up on these kind of stashable practice squad players that if they're good enough, maybe you call them up for a game or two to come in and fill in or be a special teams piece and some depth piece. Like, not all of these situations are, hey, I'm signing Gareon Conley to be a cornerback 4, or on the active game day roster every week and in the depth chart. Some of these guys are being signed to kind of get them familiar with their system, with the idea of hopefully stashing them on the practice squad and potentially using them as needed throughout the season. So
a break glass in case of emergency, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's a new type of player, a new kind of tier of player that is going to be on your roster moving forward that we haven't really dealt with previous to this, is the kind of player who is like not quite a rosterable 53-man guy, maybe just a tick better than your typical practice squad player, a guy that is a stash player that maybe plays, 4 games in the season and spends the rest of the time kind of down in the practice squad.
One of the things I've noticed is the Cowboys are becoming more open to this. I mean, even if you remember last year at the end of the year, they signed Lyle Collins and Damian Wilson on their practice squad for a playoff run. Now, neither of those guys played, right? But it was like, we have these 2 players on our roster. If for whatever reason something happens in the week, somebody gets the flu and they can't play on the Sunday, they can come in and give you adequate play despite not having a lot of practice time. I think I honestly think this happened a couple of years ago when they had all the injuries at corner and they signed, was it like Xavier Rhodes, Kenzie Alexander, and they were just stashing those guys for a playoff run, which I think was it Rhodes that ended up playing in the playoff game?
Rhodes played.
I think teams are becoming more open to the idea of a 28, 29-year-old practice squad player just to come in and be a middle reliever for a game or a 2, just to get you through a bad situation. And in the case for Gareon Conley, I also think you look at the roster, we expect Trayvon Diggs to be ready early in training camp, but probably not the first 2 weeks, right? They're not going to overwork him.
You
have Deron Bland, one of your starting outside corners. You've got Jordan Lewis, your slot corner, who is probably not going to practice every day because he's getting older.
Mm-hmm.
Who are your other outside cornerbacks that you trust right now to help you facilitate practice? Is it Eric Scott? Is it a rookie in Carson? Is it Izzy Makamu? They probably just needed more bodies that can help them get through practice.
Yeah, and I think if any type of player is going to benefit from the change in these practice squad stash rules, it's this type of player, right? Like once you reach 28 and you're not blowing the league up at your position, it becomes a lot harder to stay in the league, right? Because there's 20 and 22, 21 and 22-year-olds that are coming into the league every single year at your position. And if they're only that much like not as good as you are, the teams are definitely going to take those younger players as opposed to a 28-year-old who never flashed. But now that you have the opportunity to kind of stash these guys and potentially hold on to them just in case, there's a veteran injury and you just want somebody who has some NFL experience to throw out there on the field. There's been a lifeline for these kind of guys that get a second chance in the NFL because they have experience. They're not good. It's not too big for them. And these are the guys that normally would be replaced by younger players coming into the league and wouldn't get the opportunities, the workout chances to kind of get onto a team again. But now, because of the practice squad rules, they're getting an opportunity to be a part of a team and serve a very specific role like that. Like you mentioned, I think that's a great way of putting it, the kind of break glass in case of emergency type of veteran that you just have on your practice squad that you can kind of stash now because of the way that they've changed the practice squad rules.
And we talked about this yesterday in regards to Stephon Gilmore. There's only 4 cornerbacks in the NFL right now that are age 31 or older. And all those guys are starters. The NFL just has no interest for age 28, 29, 30-year-old cornerbacks if you're not a starter. But having a bigger practice squad and then opening it up to older players allows somebody like Gareon Conley the chance to stay on a roster. Conley isn't the only player that the Cowboys have interest in from the UFL. Let's talk about a pass rusher who the Cowboys are working out today next. This episode is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Gametime app actually go down the closer that it gets to first pitch, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee. Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. I absolutely love Gametime, and I love that you can save up to 60% off buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, and theater events near you. Save even more with exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game or the event. And save even more when you choose a section and let Gametime choose your exact seats. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that unnecessary screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, Landon, we also got news today from Tom Pelissero of NFL Network that the Cowboys are working out edge rusher Jonathan Garvin. Now, we talked about on yesterday's show how we thought the Cowboys needed to add some more depth to the defensive line. It's not a surprise that they're working out more UFL players. But what do you think about the idea of adding Garvin to the roster?
Yeah, Garvin's an interesting one. I think if you just look at his kind of general profile, he seems to kind of fit the feel of what a Zimmer defensive end looks like. He's kind of an inside-outside guy. He came into the league at 250 plus. He was a guy that at Miami, his sophomore year had a really big breakout year. And then, and if you remember, this was 2017, I think, ish. Like that was right around when Miami had a really stacked kind of defensive line. Gregory Rousseau was just about to come on the next season. And that actually kind of tampered down Garvin's junior and senior years a little bit, was kind of the rise of Gregory Rousseau. He gets, I don't know if he got drafted or not, but he ends up with Green Bay. He did. Okay. So he got drafted by Green Bay. He ends up with Green Bay, plays with them for 2 years. He doesn't really do a ton. And I the one thing I do remember about Jonathan Garvin is that he famously got cut on his birthday. And it was kind of a sad state of affairs. But he obviously goes to the UFL. He greatly improves his pass rush win rate. He definitely, that's the other thing too, just to remember about Garvin is that he came into the league, if I'm not mistaken, as the youngest or like the second youngest player in that class.
Yeah,
if I'm not
he's
mistaken.
young. Yeah.
So even now, I think he's only 24 years old, maybe 25. Like he's still very young.
24. He'll turn 25 next month.
See, that's really young. And the thing about Garvin too, if you go back and like look at, you read The Beast from the 2020 when he came out, even Dane was talking about like the guy needs some seasoning, right? He needs some time to kind of develop some stuff. He is the typical strong side defensive end, big body. He does have some ability to kind of get around the corner to bend a little bit for a guy is that size, but he's overly reliant on a swipe. He's not quite as physical as you would like for an outside, strong side defensive end. So he's not like an elite run defender necessarily.
No.
But I think much like Conley, this is a guy that is probably a practice squad stash. I mean, his situation is a little bit different because he's 4 years younger than Conley, right? So he is maybe more of a, let's see how he develops kind of upside guy, but he's not like an upside play, I would say. He's more likely a guy that, you try to kind of get some development on a little bit. And then he gets deployed probably pretty similarly to what we just talked about with Conley, where he's, maybe a practice squad guy who gets a couple of opportunities to be on a game day roster, a special teams player, especially, again, as we've talked about, the move towards more bigger bodies on special teams as kickoff return becomes more of a thing, right? So I think that he'll probably see some opportunities on special teams as part of the practice squad call-ups. And if there's injuries or if there's a break glass in case of emergency situation, he's a young guy, but he's also had snaps in the NFL already. So he at least knows what he's headed for. And I think, he could put him on the strong side and, hope for the best there. It's just kind of filling out, not the back end of your roster, but the back end of the back end of the roster, the practice squad. So I again, no downside with these kind of situations, right? Like you cut them, forget them. If it doesn't work out, that's too, it's too bad. If it works out, great. Maybe you have a guy who, I would say, as opposed to Conley, maybe this is a guy that if he really does show up in training camp, you do have him on the roster, right? Because he is young and teams, are always looking for young, big defensive linemen. So if he shows you anything worthwhile, he may make the roster, though I wouldn't expect that. I expect him to be a practice squad call-up guy.
A couple things about him in the UFL. So he actually had the second highest edge grade among all the UFL players, 91.5. Second highest pass rush grade, 33% win rate, which is absolutely absurd. 42 pressures in 12 games. Performed really, really well. Not surprising because he was somebody who recently played in the NFL with the Packers. He actually started a couple games with the Packers as well. And I know Packers fans didn't love him. They wanted more juice out of that spot. But again, he's 24 years old. We've seen there's pass rushers that were drafted this year that are 24 years old. And actually, when the Cowboys worked him out, my exact thought was, Landon, is this somebody that could compete with Tyrus Wheat for one of these hybrid spots? Him and Tyrus Wheat are the exact same age. They have almost the exact same size. Both have really long arms. I wonder if they're more open to this kind of massive Sam linebacker / edge rusher in Mike Zimmer's defense.
Yeah, I think it's certainly possible. I mean, these kind of guys who have the ability to kind of control the line of scrimmage, use leverage a little bit better. I think it makes sense that at the very least being able to hold up your man as opposed to like being blocked off the screen. Like he may not be a guy that is like, getting off his blocks and making a ton of tackles for loss in the NFL, right? But he, at the very least, with that size and that length, you feel like he could hold his spot and not give up his gap. So, yeah, I mean, I think again, like this is a little bit different situation with Conley, just because there is maybe the potential for some upside here. But I think it's very similar in the situation where he's not necessarily penciled in on the depth chart as it stands right now.
Yeah, I mean,
neither is Tyrus Wheat. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like Tyrus Wheat also is in that category.
Yeah,
sure.
it just is interesting that it looks like they're trying to get another player with a similar body type.
Yeah,
Garvin was just so productive in the UFL that I do wonder, like, maybe things finally clicked for him. Now he's never going to be an amazing athlete. He doesn't have great size. Like he's not 6'6", 270 or anything like that. But when you're 24 years old and you're whipping some pretty good tackles at a ridiculously high rate, you never know. We've seen several pass rushers in the NFL get off to a late start. I think Cameron Wake was like 28
Yeah.
years old before he even
Yeah.
played a game in the NFL.
Yeah.
Again, I know those are exceptions to the rule, and that Garvin's probably not going to be that, but it's not unheard of either.
No, and I will say that the kind of guys that do have that sort of late bloom are the guys that, it took them a while to figure out how to use their bodies, how to use their skills.
Yep.
And I think sometimes with these defensive ends, there's a lot of different body types that work. And sometimes you can kind of get pigeonholed into the wrong type of game, I guess is the best way to use it. That doesn't really fit your body type. So maybe he's a little bit more in touch with what his skill sets and his positives and negatives are. And he's working a little bit towards that. So, again, he was incredibly young when he came into the NFL and he got his first shot. I think it's certainly not unreasonable to think that he will have a better run his second time in the NFL.
All right, let's talk about an article from Pro Football Focus, which claims that the Cowboys have the worst running back room in the NFL. Doesn't matter. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We are discussing some of the latest news and notes surrounding the Dallas Cowboys. And this is the fun one from our friend Trevor Sycamore, who was just on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. He ranked all 32 running back rooms going into the 2024 season. Not surprisingly, the Cowboys are at 32. Here's what he had to say about the unit. He says, after letting Tony Pollard sign elsewhere in free agency and missing out on the top backs in the 2023 NFL draft, the Cowboys re-signed Ezekiel Elliott to be their leading rusher. Elliott's glory days came with the Cowboys, but his yards per carry average has dipped below 4.0 over the past two seasons, resulting in a career low 69.2 PFF rushing grade. Landon, my question to you, does it matter that the Cowboys have the worst running back room in the NFL?
So this is a very, very not so subtle way of asking me whether running backs matter or not. I think it I think it does make a difference. I don't know that it is going to move the needle to make this offense a bad offense. I don't think that that's the case. I also think that there is a strong misconception from outside the building, which is totally reasonable. I think totally reasonable that Ezekiel Elliott is coming back to be the kind of starting running back in this running back by committee, and I'm still just, I don't believe that. Like, I think it's if anyone is of that group has earned the right for the most touches, it's Rico Dowdle in that group. So, but I don't know that matters either, because like we're haggling over percentages. But I do think that it makes sense that the Cowboys are ranked the 32nd group in the league. Is this like an albatross that's going to sink what was the top offense in football last year? I don't think so. But I do think it is something that is a factor in the offense.
I just want to say
the factor that it used to be, and it's not the factor that many folks think it is.
No, and it's also just not a very stable thing, because I don't disagree with Trevor. I think the Cowboys going into the season have the worst running back room in the NFL. But we see this change so fast. I'm going to give you an example. I'm not picking on Trevor, but I am. He wrote this exact same article last year, ranking all the running back rooms. Coming in at number 32 were the Los Angeles Rams. In his piece, he mentioned Cam Akers and Zach Evans, and Kyron Williams went on to have 1,800 yards for them that season. Didn't even make the ranking on the thing. The next one, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, talked about Chase Edmonds, talked about Keyshawn Vaughn. Rashad White had like 1,400 yards total last year for Tampa Bay. And then there's also a team like the Bills, who were 26 on the rankings. They talked about losing Devin Singletary and Zach Moss and how big of a loss that was. And then James Cook ends up becoming this superstar in the second half of the season. We see running backs just pop out of nowhere all over the place. And if you have a good offense, you can generally produce good running back production. It's not a big deal. Like it's just not.
Yeah, I mean, it's running back is one of those positions that you shouldn't spend too much time worrying about chasing the ceiling, and you shouldn't spend too much time worrying about chasing the floor, like, or falling to the floor rather, right? Like there are ways to produce production at the running back there are ways to produce running production that don't include just having to upgrade the running back, right?
Correct.
The Cowboys, I think, have significantly, they have upgraded their run blocking situation from last year. And is that enough to compensate for the losses at the running back room? We'll find out. And again, I don't even know that this is the end of the collection of talent at the running back position. So, but I think there are several things that are true here, right? I think Trevor's ranking is absolutely correct. I think that the Cowboys offense will not, be, like I said, this albatross will not sink them.
No.
And I also think that, this is not the final, this group that was graded as the worst in the league is not the final group that the Cowboys will have before they start the season. I imagine they are going to be still adding some talent there. But even if they don't, there are ways for this running game to potentially be better than it was last year, despite the fact that the talent at running back may not look quite as good right now.
Now, PFF does a really good job ranking all the positional groups. And for the most part, like year over year, they're pretty stable. Like if you look at the offensive line rankings, they don't change much year over year unless there's big departures or injuries. But the running back room, like it can change in a month, right? Like somebody breaks out, somebody becomes, the feature point of a backfield. They're averaging 100 yards a game. And now all of a sudden they're one of the best running backs in the league. So it's the one spot that's just not very sticky from week to week, certainly not from year to year. So I think the Cowboys would be okay, Landon. I'm not worried.
I'll just add in there. Why can't Rico Dowdle be that guy? Like, why can't Rico Dowdle be the guy that everyone forgot to talk about this offseason that goes into this year and runs for 1,100 yards? There's nothing that I've seen that makes me believe that he couldn't do that, So I do think that the Cowboys, have some things in this room to be excited about. Maybe it's not quite as quality as the rest of the league, but it's a position that is notoriously difficult to predict where talent is coming from. And it's the position that you see people come out of nowhere to be major producers more so than any other position in football.
I'm excited about the running back room because there's so much uncertainty. I'm comfortable with the uncertainty, Landon.
Certainly there versus other spots, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also happy that they're finally embracing that running backs might not matter as much as they used to.
And that's fair.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. Go check out the YouTube channel. We post videos all the time over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go follow Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you next time.